Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today I will be covering the Affinity, Reality, and Communication triangle, as you can see on the diagram in front of you. Now, before we jump into that, let me go ahead and explain the basic definitions. That way there is no misunderstanding or miscommunication later on when I go into a more in-depth explanation in regards to this basic fundamental of Dianetics and Scientology. So let's go ahead and take a moment and we'll do that now. Alright, now here we have the definitions in front of us. We have affinity, reality, and communication. Now we'll keep this very, very simple. These are now the basic definitions of all these. I'm not going to go into extreme length and detail on all of them. And all three of these definitions have multiple definitions that are attributed to them. And these can be found in the technical dictionary of Scientology. But let's just keep this very, very simple to get a basic idea for everyone out there, so there's no misunderstanding here. Now, affinity is the feeling of love or liking for something or someone. Now, if you've ever had somebody that you deeply cared for or loved, boyfriend, girlfriend, wife, a husband, maybe an extended family member. Now that is a perfect example. It's somebody that we have a great deal of affection for. We very much like to be in their company and within their personal space, or we're at ease or don't mind being in their personal space. That can be considered to be an extremely high level of affinity. Now this also applies to objects, sometimes firearms, knives, shovels, tools. Somebody can like these objects very, very much. They can give them a sense of empowerment. And of course you see that all throughout history where people kept amulets, etc., little tokens and trinkets, etc. So that could apply to objects as well, and not just people. But I would say the greatest thing that monitors the degree of affinity we have for something or someone, or monitors whether or not we like something, is the distance between us and that thing. So let's take up the flip side of that. If you've ever encountered somebody that made you feel fearful, or not at ease, or they were just angry all the time, for instance, you tend to keep your distance and don't want to be very, very close to them, obviously because they make you feel uncomfortable, and this is a reflection of a lack of affinity or a lesser degree of affinity for that person. And of course, if there's no affinity whatsoever, you're running from each other, or you'd be so angry and hostile towards one another, you'd then be fighting just to get out of each other's own personal space. So that can best describe what affinity is. Now let's go ahead and move on to the other two, and I will come back and I'll tie all three of these together. Now, reality here, as you can see, second on the list, is, here on Earth, agreement as to what is. Okay, now that's pretty self-evident. It's what two, this is very important, reality can be considered also what is real to two or more people, or what is agreed upon between two or more people. Obviously, if there's just one person to say something is or exists or is real, that can qualify to them, but it doesn't necessarily have an agreement, as you can see here as part of the definition. So that usually indicates that there is two or more people agreeing upon something. So if two individuals say a light bulb is a light bulb, well then of course the reality there, or the agreement, is that it is a light bulb. Now, for instance, if you had 10 people, right, and 9 of them said, okay, it's a light bulb, but then a 10th individual comes along and says, no, it's a carrot, everyone's going to cart him off, hit him over the head, or classify him as being insane. Now, that's obviously not true, but this individual just doesn't have the same agreement, and thus reality, that these other individuals have. So again, a reality can also be considered an agreement between two or more individuals as to what is or exists or is real. All right. Now, let's go ahead here and move on to communication. Now, communication in its very simplest form is the interchange of ideas across space. Now, interchange, for those of you who don't know, is that's just the switching back or back and forth, the going back and forth of ideas across a space. So if you have two people that they're standing, they're on opposite sides of a football field, and one guy raises his right hand up in the air, the other guy on the other side of the football field raises his left hand, you could say they're communicating. Communicating what? Don't necessarily know or if that's established or not, but for that explanation, we can say that, by raising their hands, they're saying hello to one another, which is a very common practice all throughout the world. Most people would say if somebody raises their hand and waves at you, then it's a form of greeting or hello. So that can be considered to be communication, because what these individuals are trying to get across or interchange with one another or communicate to another is the idea of saying hello. Now, also, this would apply if these same two individuals both knew how to write the same language. Now, of course, each could have a piece of cardboard and they each write a number on it. One guy writes 5 on it, and the guy on the other side of the football field writes 3. They hold their pieces of cardboard up in the air. He's saying, my number is 3. The other individual is communicating that, hey, my number is 5. Now, the idea there, of course, represents the numbers of 3 and 5 that these two individuals would like to interchange across the space of a football field and communicate with one another. So that is really the basis of communication. Now, again, there's a very in-depth explanation for this particular term, communication, and there's multiple definitions for it, but this is the simpler of all these. And of course, in another presentation at some point later, I will be covering the actual formula itself, which underlies communication and proper communication. But for now, let's get back to affinity, reality, and communication, and how these are all, again, form a triangle. As you can see in this next example here, we again have the affinity, reality, and communication triangle. Here you have A for affinity, R for reality, and C for communication. Now, even though you can't necessarily see it here, usually communication would be the longer of the sides. Reason being is usually a lot more communication goes into things than anything else, but I'll get to that in a moment. So we have affinity, reality, and communication. These these 3 principles all rely upon one another, and thus you get the triangle. It means that in order to have affinity here, in order to like something, you have to be able to agree with it or have some type of understanding on it, and thus you have reality. Then you also have to be able to communicate to it or with it, right? To like that. If you have a person, for instance, that you cannot speak with because they won't answer you, obviously you can't have affinity, or you cannot like that person whatsoever because they will simply never talk with you. Another side of that coin is, well, even if someone's willing to communicate with you, if you can't agree really with anything that they are saying or doing, you don't understand them. You have no agreement with them. You have no reality. They're not really real to you because your experience set, or what's real to you, or what you've agreed upon or have had experience with before, does not match what they have. So therefore, you both have no reality with one another. So therefore, you cannot, again, have affinity for them and like them. So for the auspices, or excuse me, for the purpose of this explanation, in order to have affinity, or for this affinity to go up and for you to like something or someone even more, you have to have the agreement and reality with them. You have to be able to communicate with them. There has to be communication there. So, and again, if you to have reality on somebody, there has to be some type of liking or feeling for them, along with some communication. And then if you just want, and that of course would, raise your reality level, right? And again, we move on here to the communication side. In order to have good, fluent communication, somebody you just really, really enjoy talking to, like a person or object, and this could just be simply using something with your hands, a tool, for instance, right? You like using a hammer. You know how to use a hammer. You have a reality on a hammer, and thus you can communicate with a hammer by hitting nails into a board, for instance. So in order to really, really have a good level of communication, there has to be affinity or liking for a person or object. There has to be an agreement with a person or object. Very, very simple. So in order to raise one area of these on the triangle here, you have to raise the other two. The other two have to be in. And what do I mean by in? They have to be present. It's that simple. Now, I'll give you a practical example here, and this should illustrate the point of the ARC triangle and also how you can use it in your day-to-day life to improve it. Alright, now here we are at another little diagram here. Now please forgive me for these terrible, terrible stick figures that have no sex organs. They look a bit bizarre. I really apologize. I am not the best artist, and I cannot draw worth a hell, but I give it my best try, and I hope this will illustrate the topic of conversation here. Now, here we have two individuals, obviously. One's name is Jim here on the left-hand side, and here on the right-hand side, of course, we have a guy by the name of Joe. All right. Now, these things they have in each of their hands, got the P's on them, of course. They're phones. Now, let's just say these are iPhones, okay? Joe has an iPhone that he likes to use very, very much here. And Jim has an iPhone that he really, really likes to use, okay? Now, let's say Joe here, he's never met Jim before, okay? Well, let's just say he's off here, and this arrow down at the bottom represents, let's just say they're 15 feet apart, okay? Let's say they're waiting to take the bus, they're at a bus stop, they're each traveling to their different destinations, and Joe here spots Jim, on his iPhone. And of course, there's 15 feet of distance between them, and he says, oh, wow, Jim's got an iPhone. So he walks a bit closer to Jim and says, hey, you got an iPhone. All right. Now, when Joe here initially saw Jim, okay, with his iPhone from a distance, he automatically had a bit of affinity, potential affinity, and liking because he likes his iPhone. He said another person here, Jim, with an iPhone. He also has reality on Jim, or at least Jim's iPhone, because he owns one personally. He knows how to go through all the apps. He knows how to use all the different features of the iPhone. So therefore, it's something he understands and can have an agreement upon. So all that is lacking here, right, for these elements to go up, for Joe at least, for Joe's reality and affinity to go up, is he needs to put his communication in. Okay? Very, very simple. He sees Jim here, right? Walks up to him, says, hey man, I noticed you got an iPhone. Now he initiates or begins communication. Now automatically, Jim brightens up, looks up, he smiles, his affinity goes right up. Now Jim has a feeling of liking for Joe because he's brought up the iPhone, which Jim is also familiar with because he owns one. He has the reality on it. He understands all the features, right? And now he's communicating. So he simply says, hey, yeah, man. They start talking. He says, my name's Jim. And then Joe says, hey, my name is Joe. They both say, hey, I'd like to meet you. Then they go about back and forth communicating, right? And if all goes well and there's no disagreements or anything else, then their reality is going to go up, the communication is going to continue to go up, and the affinity's going to continue to go up. All right? That's simply how this works. So you can see how this is a very simple and fundamental principle, but it can be very, very beneficial and far-reaching in our lives. It's an extremely good interpersonal relationship tool and a good tool for dealing with other people, especially through communication. Again, communication being the larger of the three sides of this triangle, it is the one that is by far used the most. So, communication being very, very important, you can thus use communication even if you don't necessarily agree with somebody or like them or what they're saying. You can find something, for instance, that you do like about them or could admire. And of course, that will bring your affinity, reality, and communication up so you can engage in a conversation. And even being that you don't necessarily like an individual, you could just say, hey, well, even though I dislike them, for instance, they're very hardworking, etc. So your affinity can go up for them. And then, of course, you can then, using that plus communication, you can then find an agreement or a common ground. You can say, even though I don't like Walter, my coworker, for instance, he does show up on time every day and does his job. So then I can go communicate with Walter and say, hey, man, you mind covering this shift for me, or do you mind helping me do this? And then you can establish a reality with one another. Even though you don't necessarily like them naturally, given, right? You don't like them naturally like you would a loved one or a potential spouse or a potential romance. You would find something or some trait or that you could like about the person and thus have affinity for. Same thing with reality. We can usually always find something to a degree that we can agree with somebody. It's very, very rare that you can't find some type of common ground that every single thing somebody says that there's just no compromise or it's something that you just simply cannot agree with. You can usually always find something to a degree with someone that you can agree with them and have a reality with the individual. And of course, communication is just really a matter of desire and willingness. If somebody desires or has the willingness to communicate with another person, they can simply go out and communicate with them. Of course, I guess you can assume there's the factors of whether or not somebody has the good communication skills or the best communication skills, but it's really just a matter of going and saying hello to somebody. So, as a practical example, if you're out and about and you don't know anybody, but you have a random individual. Let's say you're in a bookstore, for instance. Everybody's going around, they're looking at the books. You got people having their coffees. Maybe there's even a Starbucks attached to it. Maybe it's a Barnes & Noble type bookstore. Of course, people are looking at magazines. People are getting books. They're making purchases. Now, let's say you're really, really into Stephen King or one of these other popular authors, or L. Ron Hubbard, for instance. And then you go and you see somebody picking up and looking at, breezing through, or reading a title or a book title or an author that you are familiar with. Now, you don't have to know the person, but you can say, hey, oh, they read my same author. And guaranteed, you're probably going to smile to yourself a little bit and kind of chipper up like, oh, and be interested in this individual because you're, of course, there's affinity there and reality, right? Because the author or the title or that particular book are already real to you. You've already read that, so you understand it. And thus you can have an agreement with that person if you begin to discuss it. Granted, they've already read it, but they may have not. And so now you have affinity. You can like that person. You have a basis for agreement and reality with them, thus being the book or the same author. So now the only factor that is missing that you can improve upon and raise is the communication. And that's simply done by going up to them and saying, hey, my name's Joe. Hey, my name's Mary. My name's Jim. I noticed you're, reading said author, or you're reading this author, and then you go ahead and you speak with them. Now, communication goes up. You have affinity, reality, and communication. Next thing you know, you're exchanging phone numbers and you're becoming fast friends. Now, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. That is the affinity, reality, and communication triangle. I hope my explanation has been extremely helpful to you. If you have any questions or comments, please get in touch. As always, it's thetastatic20@gmail.com. You could find my blog and the downloads and other materials and news on lronhubbardrising.com. And as always, ladies and gentlemen, I will talk to you again soon, and onward and upward.